The article that I wrote was actually for a newspaper. And what they did was that they edited it and they simplified it a lot, I should say, and then published it. So it has been published in the local newspapers, and I did another one. But what I thought I'd do today in terms of introductory remarks was to discuss what my understanding of social solidarity is, a little bit about the history of international social solidarity, especially from a more left radical point of view, but very briefly, why our Freedom Charter, which is our historical basis of the freedom struggle in South Africa, is still relevant today, both in terms of national solidarity and international solidarity. A little bit about, possibly the conditions facing the world today, and then a few concluding remarks on social solidarity during the pandemic. So I won't repeat too much of what I've already written, but try and address those 5 issues very quickly. So in terms of social solidarity, what I understand it to mean and the way that I've used the concept is that it relates to shared values, to norms and beliefs and patterns of behavior that build, very importantly, peaceful, equitable, and civilized societies. So the outcome of social solidarity should be that vision of civilized society and civilized world. At a societal level, it is based on the values of sharing and caring, of benevolence, trust and compassion, and it cannot stop at national boundaries. So social solidarity in its very nature is international. So whether one has walls or borders or not, people will move, migration of peoples will take place because of war, hunger, poverty, whatever the case may be, to earn more for a better life and so on. And also, as we have with the pandemic, viruses will cross those borders as well. So if we're talking about international social solidarity, it means addressing it in that particular way. It also means at a slightly lower level, social compliance with restrictions on individual freedoms. And this works where there's a high degree of trust in government and in each other, and it equates to self-management and social responsibility. So it's about a concern and mutual aid, which is the opposite of the values of individualism, consumerism, and alienation that go against the sense of unity that we are trying to build in the world today, and especially in the face of this epidemic. Now, over a period of time, there have been different attempts to build international solidarity, and mainly by left-wing politicians, theorists, revolutionaries, and so on. And there was, over a period of time, the first international, which started in 1864, the second international in 1889, the third international, the Comintern, around 1919, and the fourth international, which Trotsky actually introduced even later. And all of these were based on a recognition that capitalism was a global system, and if there was going to be change, it had to be global change. So what was striven for, at least what was spoken about, was the opposition to the kind of global apartheid we see today in the world amongst nations. Now, why is the Freedom Charter relevant? And I allude to this in that short article. It's because the Freedom Charter is a document based on the necessity of ensuring a socially just society. And this was put together democratically in 1955 at the Congress of the People here in South Africa. All the congresses, the democratic congresses, got together. 50,000 volunteers went out into communities, came back with the people's demands and ideas of what a just society would be. And this was synthesized into a 10-point document. And that was the basis on which actually the African National Congress came to power. because the Freedom Charter was the basis to draw up the Reconstruction and Development Program, and that was the basis for political power in 1994. And the preamble says South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And in the paper, I wrote that the world belongs to everyone who lives in it as well. So I was referring to the Freedom Charter, which, if you look at on an international scale, makes good sense in terms of social solidarity. It says that no government can claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people, that the people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty, and peace by a government founded on injustice and inequality, and it goes on. And it lists 10 points that are fundamental even today, and even for us in South Africa, despite the fact that the Reconstruction and Development Program and the Constitution of South Africa, to a large extent, is based on the precepts that are contained in the Freedom Charter. So it talks about the people shall govern, all groups shall have equal rights, there should be human rights for all, there should be equality before the law, work and security, housing, education, and importantly, peace and friendship, because this relates not just to peace and friendship amongst the peoples of South Africa, but with the peoples of the world internationally. So it can be used in any country as a basis for solidarity and actually as a basis for internationalism. So the clause on peace and friendship talks about sovereignty, about negotiation, not war, about the right to self-determination, and so on. And what we see in the world today is really different to what we envisaged. In terms of what we see in the world today, there's a unipolar world with US dominance. There are structural crises, political crises of legitimacy, economic hegemony by the center, which is basically Western Europe and the United States, but mainly the US. And there's an acceleration of inequality. And just this week, I read that 20% of the world's population control 95% of the world's wealth. There's massive unemployment and rising unemployment worsened by the pandemic that we are dealing with. And the way in which governments are dealing with it is a repeat of the 2008 model, where there are bailouts, there are massive resources to banks and corporations, and really very small amounts, insignificant amounts that are going to the poor. Even in South Africa, the president announced an 800 billion rand package, which is extraordinary. But again, it's to stimulate business and get the economy going. So what we have in the world is war, conflict, repression, perpetual war for profit. As you know, the US military has operations in 80 countries as we speak. And South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. 50% of our people are unemployed. The majority are in precarious work, which is affected by conditions like that we are facing now. There's extreme poverty. There's corruption in the political domain. We have a state capture commission, and there's divisions and weakening of the labor movement, so that resistance is actually weaker. So how do we build social solidarity then during the pandemic? What is not required is the cutting of funding to the World Health Organization, denying Iran, Venezuela medical assistance, continued sanctions, perpetual war, drug monopolies by big pharmaceutical companies, blaming and labeling the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, and who's responsible for this, and so on. Intellectual property in the health sphere, we need to discuss in detail. And how social media creates isolated, competitive individualism. So what do we need? We need a balance between individual freedoms and the public health good. We need to support the World Health Organization that is speaking the language of solidarity. And you may know that just today, the World Health Organization launched an initiative aimed at accelerating the drive to find a vaccine, to provide treatment, and also to do so internationally on an equitable basis. And noticeable by absence was President Trump, when almost all the Western presidents were part of that meeting, offered their solidarity and support. There was nothing from the United States. So international cooperation of the best scientific minds, the best resources, is necessary to develop a patent-free vaccine, something that would not put profits before the public health of nations and especially of poor people. And if we look at what is happening in the world, Cuban doctors have gone to Europe. Indian drugs have been sent out of the country to many countries. The Russians have sent personal protective equipment and aid to Italy. The Chinese have sent money and aid to many African countries. The Vietnamese have built ventilators, which they are sharing. The Chinese have sequenced the virus and have shared it. So for me, those are examples of international solidarity. And whether we agree with the political regimes in power in those countries, these attempts at building social solidarity and international solidarity, I think, are commendable. And governments with the capacity to respond should adopt, I think, an interventionist approach, commandeering where necessary. So in conclusion then, what should we be doing? Change comes from people understanding that it is necessary for their own self-preservation. So even international capital, big business should understand that assisting in this crisis in a manner that supports all of humanity is actually assisting themselves. In this country, we have 2 or 3 families that control 50% of the wealth of the nation. The Ruperts, the Oppenheimers, the Motsepes. They've donated R1 billion each towards our campaign. And this contributes to that ideology of the philanthropic capitalist. But they understand that it is in their self-interest, because Business for South Africa put out a report yesterday that said that the risks emanating from the present crisis relate to loss of livelihoods, social unrest and riots, inability to maintain law and order, breakdown of the social compact between government, business, labor, and society, and essentially the end of a profitable society. So it is in the interest of big business to support campaigns of international solidarity that will address this pandemic. And I think our task at different levels, in the groups that we are in the communities that we're in, the organizations that we belong to, is to use what space we have to build solidarity internationally, in the community, human bonds at all levels. And essentially, that's what I was saying, that physical distancing is about staying away from someone 2 meters or 6 feet. But whilst we physically distance, let's build social solidarity. And in some ways, the term social distancing was misunderstood. And that's the point I actually make there. So I'd like to stop there, and I think we could discuss some of those, the background that I've given. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would not want to comment first. I'd like to hear other people get into the discussion. Yes, Farzan.
So yeah, I think it's very interesting the way you started with international various up to the 4th. There are some ideas. I remember Samir Amin proposed the idea of a 5th international. And I think that's an interesting thing to talk about, to think about, but also the space between micro level and macro level. So when we talk about the international, we also need to talk about why they failed, what we learned from those failures. So we don't, and that I think is that space between micro, the individual, the organizational issues of ethics, and ultimately issue of exclusion and how exclusion works and how it is generalized and universalized in a sense. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, firstly, on Samir Amin's views, I had the good fortune to take a long drive with him from Durban to Mthatha about 15 years ago, when he was a guest speaker at the South African Sociological Association annual meeting. So I had a chat with him. He was a Marxist revolutionary in the traditional sense. He was a diehard. He believed that the era of monopoly capitalism offered contradictions which could be exploited by the international proletarian movement or movements. But I think, I asked him, but given the balance of forces, how do you propose that we actually bring about fundamental change? And his response to me was, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking, how do we change the balance of forces? So Samir, I think is a great intellectual. I agree with a lot of what he said. I think he was the eternal optimist. I think in the modern day, if we look at the balance of forces, the possibility of revolutionary change is extremely remote. And even in the peripheries where it is, I think that the conditions are more ripe for that kind of response. As we're seeing in South Africa now, there's looting of supermarkets, there's stoning of police, and there's social unrest in different parts of the country. So those are the kinds of conditions that we have in countries like South Africa and many other African countries. But the possibility for revolutionary change is not there. I think that the possibility for peaceful change by showing elites that it is in their interest to make those changes and to start with the pandemic, which affects everyone now, I think would be a good start, because it's a really great start. And I was proud when I listened to the World Health Organization today in terms of bringing the world together. Let's find this vaccine and let's share the information and make sure that the poor are at the center of it and they benefit from the best science that the world has to offer. So whilst I think Amin's views are powerful and food for thought, the possibility of the kind of world that he envisioned is way into the future. I don't think that we are civilized enough as human beings to realize that potential at this point in time. And one shouldn't have a short sense of history. I think change takes place over hundreds of years. So in one's lifetime, if things don't happen, one tends to get disillusioned. But in terms of looking at social change, it is a process that takes hundreds of years. And the mightiest of empires have fallen historically. I think you're correct also about a micro and a macro analysis of the situation. I spoke in very broad brushstrokes and very quickly, so I didn't go into the micro elements of the ethics of participation, public participation, and those kinds of things which are necessary during this time, because there's also the tendency towards authoritarianism. It is very easy during lockdowns and under these conditions for governments to move towards authoritarianism as opposed to the democracy that we've been striving for. So at national levels, we have this problem that we have to deal with as well. So I agree, and I think we need to look at questions of social exclusion as well, marginalization, exclusion during this time. And how do we ensure that that authoritarianism doesn't become the order of the day? We have seen the army and the police, for example, shoot people. Um, Isolated incidents, but there were complaints of heavy-handedness about the way the army is running the lockdown. And in the townships, given the numbers of people in very dense settlements under unhygienic and difficult conditions, sometimes without running water, it's extremely difficult for people to follow the harsh conditions of lockdown that we have. So the response has been a harsh one.
I would like to just comment that I think it's interesting that you put this in a historical context, because it seems to me that we have the problem that the poor and the disenfranchised people of the world don't have strong institutions almost by definition. And there are sources of institutional power that have developed over time, the nation state and the corporation. And those kinds of institutions have become dominant because one advantage that institutions have is that they last for long periods of time. And they can therefore acquire the power to carry out their wishes. There's nothing comparable. I think that it was interesting that you mentioned the Comintern, because it seems like that was an attempt to build an international institution, but we saw the problem of that, well, who was going to run that institution and for what purposes? But I think they had the problem identified, they didn't have a solution to it. The problem was that you needed to have something that was comparable in power and permanence to the nation state or the corporation. And I don't think that politically, I've always been a believer in bottom-up organization, but one of the problems of organizations at the bottom is they usually don't last very long. They don't usually have very much power. Now, whether they could ever reach the point where NGOs on an international basis would actually be able to stand up to, say, the nation state or the corporation. I think we've seen with the World Health Organization, when, 50% of the budget comes from the United States, that's hardly something that you can stand up to. So I don't know whether you've thought about, you've kind of suggested it might take 100 years or more to develop civil society organizations that actually have the power to combat the state and combat corporations.
Yeah, no, I agree, Clay. I think what I'm suggesting is that we need to mobilize around issues of common concern. So challenging the nation state and international corporations is not on the cards, as you correctly point out. But given that the pandemic is something that has affected everyone, we have a chance here to build solidarity around that, and in the public health sphere then to make advances towards the kind of humane society we want to see in the future. So what I'm saying is that even if we come out of this pandemic with an international, with a vaccine that is made available internationally, where bonds are built between scientists, between and among scientists across national boundaries and in different universities around the world, and that collaboration can continue towards the benefit of all humanity, we'd make a really significant gain in the face of big pharmaceutical companies controlling patents, and that have led to the deaths of possibly millions of people over the last 50 years. because of the unavailability, the unaffordability of medication that is patented mainly in the United States. So I agree with you. It's not about challenging the nation state at all. And you're right. If you look at the Comintern and other attempts at internationalism, there were cultural differences, there were linguistic differences, there were ideological differences within the left, there were local loyalties, and all of those served to work against the building of a common internationalism at the time. So possibly an issue-based approach, as the challenges are confronted us, those of us committed to building social solidarity on all levels, work within our communities to as far as possible, ensure that that is done. You're also correct that the World Health Organization is dependent on the United States, $400 million last year. And that has been suspended now and possibly will not resume. So I think it's a lesson as well in terms of being totally dependent. It's about how do international organizations that are committed to the common good begin to function in a way that there's no dependency on the United States in the way that we have seen up until now. And the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Ghebreyesus, announced today that a fund is being set up from the 4th of May, where international contributions will be welcomed and so on. So, and with the support of Germany, the UK, Italy, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and so on, the possibilities are there to get the organization moving and to bring the United States back on board. But it also requires pressure in the United States. I think being in the US, one gets a particular point of view. And from the outside, there's a completely different point of view that we have. And the truth may be somewhere in the middle. I know that when I was in the US, I was there during 9/11, for example, for 2 months. And I saw it from a completely United States point of view. And then I came back home, and then I began to see different explanations and a different approach to what happened there in relation to US actions and policies and so on. And we know what has happened in the Middle East and what is happening currently around the world. So yeah, that's my top of the mind response to those issues that you raised, Clay.
This is Margaret, and I wanted to thank you very much for this paper. And I think you mentioned that it has so far been published in a newspaper. And, you know, I think it is such an important set of thoughts about reformulating the way we conceive of social distancing and how we right now we're very preoccupied with in the US about when can we reopen, and the presumption is that we're all dormant until we can reopen. And what I like about your paper and your terminology is that social solidarity continues and it doesn't depend on physical proximity. So my question is, how can we expand this message? I mean, I think it's very important as a way of changing attitudes as we move forward and become more activist. Is it going to be published anywhere else? Can we help share it in different publications and in the media?
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. I think that we need to get not necessarily my paper, but similar ideas published widely in the mainstream media and in popular newspapers. I mean, we know that really very, very few people read academic journals. It is only academics who have a specialized interest in a particular subject who would read something on Samir Amin. There are others who have never heard of Samir Amin, for example. So I think, how do we popularize this knowledge? How do we make it available in a manner that it's easily understood and it presents a countervailing force and tendency to the mainstream ideas that we see in the international media on a daily basis? So for me, it's about getting it out there into the newspapers, even if we have to use social media. I would like to suggest that this would be a responsible use of social media to get these ideas out there and get people thinking, discussing, and contributing. And I think there is sufficient goodwill in the world for that to happen. There's sufficient goodwill in our communities, and even amongst business communities, there's goodwill that's enough to drive those processes. So we need to popularize the information.
I would like to say that these ideas are really excellent, and I'm heavily involved at the United Nations, and I will look to distributing them there. And one of the couple of things they do, which are very compatible with what you're saying, is they hope to develop interest in progressive ideas by pointing out the connection between peace and development and prosperity, in that you can't really have development and prosperity unless you have peace. And so therefore that reflects what you were saying, how it's in the interest of the elites to work on peace and develop peace so that they can then make their money. And this is also reflected in a movement that's being championed at the United Nations called peace building, which says that you can't have long-lasting peace unless you have progressive systems, that promote equality and promote, justice and human rights and things like that, otherwise peace will not last without those things. And then the final thing is that they're promoting what's called a culture of peace, which really also reflects your ideas. It's not only the culture of peace is defined as, those various progressive ideas like, justice and freedom and equality and things like that, but also that all segments of society must be involved in maintaining it and building peace so that everyone, for the benefit of everyone, so everyone can prosper.
Yeah, I agree totally. And especially with your last remark that all segments of society should be involved. So what we've done in Durban through the Durban municipality is to set up a special program at the Durban University of Technology on public participation. And over the last 4 years, we've trained 600 municipal employees through a one-year program where they get a higher certificate, it's called a higher certificate, in public participation. In an attempt to try and create the ideal public servant who understands what the civil service is there for, and that the roles are to serve the public, but also to empower the public to participate fully at the level of decision making in, for example, the budgetary process of municipalities. And all other important decisions that are taken in the municipality, which is local government that is closest to the people. So that is a program that I developed and that I've overseen over the last 3 or 4 years for the municipality that's been hugely successful. And we intend to continue that program. We've also had 2 international conferences on public participation that included our municipal employees and speakers from the International Sociological Association, the research committee that I belong to. So I agree totally in this culture of peace building, and whatever we can do to foster and promote those ideas of peace, because if we run proper public participation programs, the number of public protests that we see on a daily basis throughout this country will certainly come down. It's people who feel that they don't have a say in the system. They are not taken into account in decision making. They have no idea of what is going on in local government. And the way in which public participation is being done at the moment is not effective, not impactful, and doesn't reach the ordinary person in the community.
Thank you.
Perhaps one area where we might have some impact, I think that the language of human rights is a language that most people understand. I recall it hearing Prasad saying he's never been in front of an audience where, say, ask people, are they in favor of human rights? Most people will raise their hands. They might not know what it means, but they raise their hands. So, and I think that putting things in the language of human rights, like healthcare as a human right, perhaps also expanding that to the notion of ideas, the way in which we take for granted that someone can patent an idea, patent a gene, things that come out of nature. All of these kinds of, I think that's where the present system is somewhat vulnerable. That a lot of people, I think, begin to question, well, does that mean that someone owns this forever or for the next 75 years or 100 years? There is a sense of unfairness about that. And particularly when we realize that, as you pointed out, patenting medicine is something that has a tremendous impact on people's lives. The number of people in the world who are diabetic and cannot get insulin at a reasonable price. That's a public health issue that probably is killing as many people as the pandemic that we have right now. So I think we do have an opportunity to promote ideas in terms of the rhetoric of human rights. And, because I think inevitably human rights is a check on the power of both nation states and corporations. It's probably the only check we can really use effectively.
I agree. I think the challenge for us is immediately it's health, but if one looks at the South African context, for example, it's education, it's welfare, and the privatization of those essential areas of social life is problematic. And so for us, some of us at least, we would like to see greater state intervention in health, education, and welfare, more money being spent in those areas, together with what we used to call poverty eradication programs. With the terminology changed to poverty alleviation later on. I think there was some realization that the eradication of poverty was too big a goal, but and it's a change that some of us didn't agree with. But the kinds of programs that are in place are not serving to eradicate poverty in South Africa at the moment. So health, education, and welfare are very important for us as human rights that need to be delivered and that are fundamental to the Freedom Charter that I spoke about and our Constitution, which we always claim as one of the most enlightened constitutions in the world. But is it a living document? I'm not so sure.
Shanta, please speak up. Did you have a question?
Thank
Shanta?
you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm actually using a new headphone. I'm sorry. I just need permission to use this information. You say you'd like it spread. I'm actually on an international panel in 2 weeks' time with Orbix Training UAE, and I'm also one of their speakers next week. I'm dealing with personal growth and development, and I'm very much into changing mindsets, right? We have met personally, so you know who you're speaking to. But yeah, may I use your information? May I quote you? and also on my YouTube channel. May I just, summarize this as best as I can on a 20-minute motivational whatever. So if I could just have your permission to spread this in that way.
Yeah, no problem at all, Chandra. Thank you.